A baby cries somewhere in the field. Then the sound cuts off. Inside a ring of wagons, the air sits heavy with the smell of iron and blood. A woman stares at nothing. Her fingers are knotted in her son's hair. The boy's face has turned blue. She makes no sound at all. A few steps away, another mother lays her infant daughter on the dirt. She rolls a loaded wagon wheel over the small body. There is a single, dull crack. This is not the mess of a battle lost. This is a plan. A people looked at what was marching toward them and decided a mother's hand was kinder than the alternative. What enemy pushes a whole nation to kill itself? What terror makes a mother choose to end her own child? The answer wore Roman armor, a legion built into a killing machine by a man as hard as the republic he served. For over a decade, the northern tribes, the Cimbri and their allies, had hung over Italy like a coming storm. Rome had a name for the fear: the Terror Cimbricus. It had smashed army after army. It had shamed the Senate. It had drained the legions white. So this last meeting was not about land. It was not about glory. It was an exorcism. Rome meant to erase a nightmare by wiping out the people who carried it. Two men designed that end. The first was an aging soldier of low birth named Gaius Marius. He had torn up Rome's oldest military rules and forged an army in his own image, an army loyal to him alone. Behind him stood the second man, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Pale, patient, ambitious, he watched his commander. He memorized every lesson the war offered, and he waited. The field of Vercellae in 101 BC would be the grave of one nation. It would also be the birthplace of a rivalry so bitter, it would one day set the Republic itself on fire. Let us know which city and country you are watching from in the comments below. Take a moment to subscribe and join our mission to bring these lost stories back to life. You're watching Romanus, your home of Roman Empire on YouTube. The salt came first. Not a wave, not a storm surge, a slow gray seep that soured the fields of Jutland and swallowed the pastures whole. The North Sea had breached the dunes, and once the brine touched the soil, nothing grew back. For the Cimbri who farmed that coast, it read like a verdict from the gods. The ground was dying under their feet. They were not a war band chasing plunder. They were a nation turned homeless. Whole families, entire herds, everything they owned loaded onto wagons with high wicker sides. Old men rode inside. Children walked beside the oxen. Dogs trailed the column. They gathered their allies, the Teutones and the Ambrones, and started south. Ancient counts put their numbers past 300,000 souls, though the Romans, who feared them, may have swollen the figure. They wanted one thing: a patch of earth that would not drown them. They went looking for a home. They found Rome instead. The first meeting came in 113 BC, high in the eastern Alps near Norea. A Roman consul named Gnaeus Papirius Carbo was watching the passes into Italy. The Cimbri sent no war cry. They sent envoys. Give us land. Let us settle somewhere inside your territory. The Republic held more ground than any of these people could imagine, and they asked for a corner of it. Carbo agreed to let them pass. Then he set an ambush in the mountains and struck them on the march. It was treachery, and it backfired. The Cimbri turned and shattered his army. A thunderstorm broke over the peaks and scattered the survivors through the fog. Carbo escaped with a handful of men and later took poison rather than face the shame. Rome had drawn first blood, lost, and taught these strangers that Roman promises were worthless. The question of land still traveled to the Senate. Inside the Curia Hostilia, the patricians heard the reports of tall, fair-haired wanderers and saw nothing worth answering. Barbarians, nomads who did not grasp what civilization meant. The reply stayed flat. No, Rome did not hand out land. Rome seized it. Drive them off. That contempt would cost the Republic more than 100,000 lives. It would light a war that burned for over a decade. And it would end in extermination. For years, the migration drifted along the frontier, a pressure building against the border. In 109 BC, the consul Marcus Junius Silanus met them in southern Gaul and was beaten. In 107 BC, another army under Lucius Cassius Longinus was destroyed near Bertigala by the Tigurini, a tribe riding with the horde. Cassius died in the field. His lieutenant Gaius Popilius bought the survivors' lives by surrendering half their baggage and passing under the yoke, stripped and bent beneath a frame of spears. Rome never forgave him and later dragged him into court for it. Every defeat sharpened the enemy's name and thickened the dread back home. They fought unlike any barbarian Rome had faced, with the reckless nerve of people who had no country to retreat to. This was not raiding. This was a nation on the move, pointed at Italy. The wound that never healed opened on the 6th of October, 105 BC, near a small town called Arosio, on the banks of the Rhone. Call it what it was, not a battle, a collapse. The worst military disaster the Republic ever suffered. A day of butchery that made the old nightmare of Cannae look small. 2 Roman armies camped on opposite banks of the river. One belonged to the consul Gnaeus Malleus Maximus, a self-made man with no noble blood. The other belonged to the proconsul Quintus Servilius Capio, an aristocrat fresh from sacking the sanctuary at Tolosa. He had seized a hoard of gold and silver from the temples there, the famous Aurum Tolosanum, and much of it vanished on the road under his own guard. Men whispered that Caepio had stolen it. The gold was said to be cursed, and the curse would follow every hand that touched it. Caepio could not stomach taking orders from a man of lesser birth. He refused to combine his forces. When Maximus rode over to plead with him, Caepio would barely speak. Senate commissioners sent from Rome begged the 2 men to unite. Caepio broke off and pitched his own camp closer to the enemy, so the glory would be his alone. Earlier, a captured senator named Marcus Aurelius Scaurus had been dragged before the Cimbri chief Boiorix and told the tribes to leave Italy or be destroyed. Boiorix had him burned alive for the insolence. The tribes were not bluffing. The Cimbri did not need to split the Romans apart. The Romans had done it for them. They fell on Caepio's isolated camp first. The legionaries fought. The legionaries died. The whole force was swallowed. Caepio watched his own sons cut down before the warriors closed in. Across the water, the Second Army could only stand and witness the slaughter of their countrymen. Then their turn came. The Cimbri surged over the river at first light, drunk on the first kill. Maximus had the water at his back and nowhere to send his men. The line dissolved into panic. Soldiers threw off armor and weapons and tried to swim, but the current was strong and the enemy was on their heels. Bodies piled in the Rhone until men said the river itself was damned with the dead. Maximus survived, but both his sons died in the rout. After the fighting, the Cimbri did what Roman writers never forgot. They gathered the plunder and destroyed it. They tore the captured gold and silver into pieces and threw it into the river. They drowned the horses. They hanged the prisoners from the trees as an offering to their gods, and their priestesses, gray-haired women in white robes, cut the throats of captives over great bronze cauldrons and read the future in the falling blood. Nothing was kept. It was religion, not greed, and it terrified Rome more than any looting. The count was beyond reckoning. 80,000 legionaries, another 40,000 camp followers and allies, 120,000 gone before the sun set. What reached Rome was not the report of a defeat. It was the report of an erasure. Two consular armies had simply stopped existing. The road into Italy lay open. In the city, women put on mourning. The Senate forbade men of military age from leaving Italy and closed the ports to them. Every fit citizen was liable for service. The fear finally had a name: Terror Cimbricus. Rome had not felt anything like it since Hannibal camped outside its walls a century before. In that darkness, the Republic did the unthinkable. It broke its own bones. For 400 years the law had been sacred. No man could hold the consulship 2 years running, and no man could hold it again inside 10 years. The rule existed for one reason: to keep any single man from gathering too much power. The Senate and people of Rome took that rule and threw it in the fire. They turned to a grim, humorless soldier from Arpinum, a hill town south of Rome that had held full citizenship for barely a generation. A man the nobles sneered at as vulgar, a farmer's son who spoke poor Greek and boasted openly of his scars. Gaius Marius. He had made his name crushing King Jugurtha in Numidia, and now he stood as the only man Rome trusted. They made him consul for 104 BC, then 103, then 102, 101, and 100, 5 terms in a row. A pile of power no Roman had ever legally held. In its terror, Rome had just built its first warlord. Marius saw what the blue bloods refused to see. The old army was finished. The machine that had crushed Carthage no longer worked. For centuries, only men who owned property could serve. The reasoning was clean. A man with land would fight to keep it. But the land had drifted upward. Small farms were swallowed by huge estates, worked by chained slaves. The cities filled with a landless mass called the capite censi, the head count. Men tallied by their heads because they owned nothing else. No property, no stake, no reason to bleed for the Republic. The Senate saw a mob to be managed. Marius saw a weapon waiting to be forged. He tore up the property rule. He opened the legions to any citizen with a working body. He gave them gear, state pay, and a future. And he gave them the promise that mattered most: land at the end of their service. Land that he, their general, would win for them. With that single change, he rewrote Roman history. He had not just filled the ranks, he had rerouted their loyalty. These men would not die for an idea called the Senate and people of Rome. They would die for the man who fed them and paid them and guaranteed their old age. They would die for Marius. He had built a private army wearing state colors, the same tool that, within 2 generations, would be turned on the Republic and kill it. He gave that army a new emblem, too. Before Marius, the legions marched under a mix of standards: boars and wolves and horses. He fixed a single sign above them all: the silver eagle. From that day, the aquila became the soul of a legion. To lose it was worse than death, and men would spend their lives to carry it home. It was branding, and it worked. When a soldier looked up and saw the eagle, he saw Marius. Just as he began shaping this weapon, the Cimbri made their one fatal error. After Arusio, the road to Rome sat undefended. They could have walked into Italy and burned the city. They didn't. Maybe they were tired. Maybe the soft lands to the west looked like easier picking. Whatever the reason, they turned toward Spain and crossed the Pyrenees, where the tribes there fought them to a standstill and drove them back. The Teutones and Ambrones stayed in Gaul. The great wave had split in 2. That delay handed Marius the only thing he truly needed: time. Time to take the beggars and the broke from the back alleys of Rome and beat them into the deadliest army the world had known. He set them digging a canal near the mouth of the Rhone, a channel later called the Fossa Mariana, to move supplies inland by ship instead of by road. It kept them busy, it kept them hard, and it let him watch the enemy approach at his own pace. He trained them past the edge of cruelty. Every man carried his own tools, his own rations for weeks, his own stakes for the walls. The packs grew so heavy, the soldiers earned a nickname: Marius's mules. He marched them until their feet split, then marched them further. Every night, no matter how spent, they dug a full fortified camp before they slept. He remade their gear as well. The story goes that he altered the pilum, the heavy javelin, by swapping one iron rivet in the head for a wooden pin. On impact, the pin snapped and the shaft bent sideways, so the enemy could not throw it back and could not tear it free of his shield. A small change, a deadly one. The gladius stayed a stabbing blade, and he taught them to work it like a factory line. Step, stab, twist, pull, step, stab, twist, pull. No flourish, no dueling, just a steady advance that fed men into a grinder. He was not raising soldiers. He was manufacturing killers. He also kept a prophetess named Martha at his side, a Syrian woman who traveled in a covered litter and foretold the outcome of each move. His wife Julia had introduced her. The soldiers came to trust the old woman's readings as much as their general's orders. Julia was the aunt of a boy not yet born into fame, Gaius Julius Caesar, whose family would rise on the back of Marius's name. Around this time, a young officer joined the staff, pale, sharp-eyed, from an old family that had slid into poverty and debt. Lucius Cornelius Sulla. He had already served Marius in Africa, where he personally talked the Mauritanian king Bacchus into handing over Jugurtha, and he never let anyone forget it. He even had a signet ring cut showing that surrender scene, and he wore it for the rest of his life. Now he watched the older man build his machine and filed away every lesson. The two would need each other in the coming fight. They would spend the rest of their lives hating each other for it. Before facing the Cimbri, Marius needed to test the machine. The rehearsal came in 102 BC at Aquae Sextiae in southern Gaul, beside a hot spring where the Romans would later build the town of Aix. The Teutones and Ambrones were finally moving toward Italy. Marius trailed them and refused every offer of open battle. He kept his men behind their walls and made them stand on the rampart and stare at the passing horde until the sight stopped frightening them. The column took 6 days to file past. Warriors shouted up at the walls, asking the legionaries if they had any messages for their wives, since they would soon be lying with them. The men wanted to charge. Marius held them back. He was hunting for the right ground. He found it beside a river. He camped on a high ridge and cut the enemy off from the only water for miles. The plan was cruel in its simplicity. Let the summer do the fighting. Thirst worked on the tribes. The first clash came almost by accident. Roman servants went down to the river to fetch water, met the Ambrones bathing there, and a brawl exploded into a full engagement. The Ambrones charged across the stream, shouting their own tribal name as a war chant. The Ligurian troops in Marius's ranks heard it, recognized the old word as their own, and roared it back. Two peoples screamed the same name at each other across the water before they started killing. The Ambrones broke. The river ran red, and their own women met the fleeing men at the wagons and cut them down as cowards. That night, both armies lay awake in the dark. The wailing from the enemy camp did not sound like grief. It sounded like beasts howling. The Romans gripped their weapons and waited for a night assault that never came. 2 days later, Marius sprung the real trap. He sent an officer named Claudius Marcellus with 3,000 men to hide in the wooded hills behind the enemy through the night. At dawn, Marius drew the tribes into a charge up the slope, under a hard sun, straight into the waiting line. The climb wrung the strength out of them. The Romans held the high ground and worked their blades. At the signal, Marcellus struck the rear from the trees. A vice closed shut. Ancient writers put the dead near 90,000 and the captives at 20,000. Their king Teutobod, said to clear 4 horses in a single leap, was taken alive and saved for the triumph in Rome. The story should have ended there. It did not. The worst of aquae sextiae came after the swords went quiet. The legions closed on the wagon camp expecting easy slaves. The women had decided otherwise. They had sent word to Marius begging to serve as priestesses to the goddess Vesta, rather than live as property. He refused, or the plea never reached him in time. When the soldiers entered, they met axes and knives and bare hands. The women fought around their wagons with a fury that froze veteran legionaries in place. When the last ring broke, they did not surrender. They killed their children first, then themselves. Some hanged themselves from the wagon poles with rope. Some tied nooses to their own necks and lashed them to the horns of their oxen, then drove the beasts forward until they choked. One account tells of a mother found with a child hanging from each foot and a noose around her own throat. Nothing was left to capture. It was a message written in bodies. We will not be enslaved. We will be erased. Local farmers, the story goes, later fenced their vineyards with the bones and turned the rotted dead back into the soil, and the ground gave record harvests for years. The name of the field became a curse and a boast in the same breath. Word of the mass suicide spread across Gaul and over the mountains. In the valleys of northern Italy, the Cimbri heard it. Their allies were gone, their brothers wiped from the earth. Now they stood alone. Yet they had already forced the Alpine passes and poured onto the Italian plain, brushing aside the army of Marius's co-consul Quintus Lutatius Catulus, who had abandoned the line of the river Adige and fallen back in disorder toward the Po. The Cimbri were inside Italy. They were bathing in the cold rivers, testing the ice on the mountain streams, sliding down snowbanks on their broad shields for sport. They believed the war was already won. If a story like this grips you, then you belong with us. Subscribe and join the lineage, our inner circle here on the channel, and help us drag these buried stories back into the light. Now let us return to the field. Marius broke off preparations for his triumph, left the Teuton dead behind him, and marched north to join Catulus. He would not celebrate his victory yet. There was still one enemy left, the largest of them all, camped on Roman soil and certain of its fate. The snows on the passes had melted. The 2 Roman armies were merging into one host, and Boiorix, king of the Cimbri, rode up to the Roman lines with a message for Gaius Marius. Name the day. Name the place. We will fight. Marius named both. A wide flat plain called Vercellae, the morning of the 30th of July. Neither man yet knew the ground would swallow an entire people. Spring, 101 BC. The Cimbri poured down through the Alpine passes into the valley of the Po. Green country, wide and rich, shimmering under a sun they had never felt in the north. They had wintered in the high country and grown soft on it. Plutarch says they crossed the mountains in loose bands, sliding down the snow on their shields, wrestling in the drifts, testing the ice of the streams like children. They were a people who had spent 13 years on the road and finally believed the road was ending. The Roman army waiting in the plain belonged to Quintus Lutatius Catulus, old blood, thin talent. He had first tried to hold the line of the river Adige, throwing a bridge across it and building a fort to guard the crossing. When the Cimbri began damming the river above him with felled trees and heaped earth to sweep his bridge away, his men lost their nerve. The garrison in the fort held long enough that Catulus later gave them their freedom by a formal act, praising their courage as if it were his own. The rest of his army broke and fell back across the Po, and Catulus, to save face, claimed he had led the retreat himself, so his men would not seem to run without their general. The Cimbri were now loose in northern Italy, stripping the farms bare and taking what they liked. They did not march on Rome. They celebrated. In their minds, the hard part was done. They had crossed the mountains, scattered a Roman army, and found the land they had chased for over a decade. What they did not know was that a peace embassy of their own had already gone to Rome, asking for land and seed corn for themselves and their brothers, the Teutones. They did not know the Teutones were already dead. When a Roman officer told the envoys that their brothers had their land now and would keep it forever. The Cimbri did not grasp the cruelty of it until it was far too late. They had walked onto an anvil. The hammer was already moving. Gaius Marius came up from the south. He was serving his 5th consulship, an office no living Roman had held so many times, and he folded the wreck of Catulus's army into his own. Together, the two commanders led more than 50,000 trained men. The joining was not friendly. Catulus was a patrician with a taste for Greek poetry, a man who would later write his own account of the campaign to claim his share of the glory. Marius was a farmer's son from Arpinum who despised him. The two would command the same field and hate each other across it. Marius found the Cimbri camped on a broad flat stretch the Romans called the Raudian Plain, near Vercellae, in the level country west of the Po. And he waited. He let the days stretch. He let the July heat settle over the valley like a lid. This was not idleness. It was a weapon. His men were mostly Italians, raised in this heat. The Cimbri came from cold mist and short summers. The sun would fight for him. The heat would soften them before a single blade was drawn. The dust of the plain would be a legion he never had to feed. He picked the killing ground the way a butcher picks his cut. He had learned patience the hard way. At Aquae Sextia, the year before, he had watched thirst break the Teutones. Now he would let the sun do the same work on their kin. The Cimbri king Boiorix belonged to an older world. A giant on horseback, his helmet crowned with the head of a beast, his mount decked for war. He rode out toward the Roman line and reined in. No screaming, no threats. He spoke like a king. Name the day, name the place. Let our two peoples settle the world in one battle. It was brave. It was noble. It was a mistake. Marius was no hero from a saga. He was a professional killer, and he read the king's honor as a weakness to be spent. He accepted at once. The 3rd day from now, he said, on the open plain called the Raudian Field. Boiorix rode back satisfied, and Marius turned to his officers. Beside him stood Lucius Cornelius Sulla, now serving as quaestor over supply and pay. The two men had served together in Africa, where Sulla had taken the surrender of Jugurtha and worn the credit ever since. Marius had grown to distrust him and had shifted him onto Catulus's staff, telling himself it kept the younger man away from real command. Sulla went and thrived. He handled Catulus's supply lines so well that the men came to trust him more than their own consul, and he later wrote in his memoirs that Marius had done him a favor by casting him off. since it gave him a command he could call his own. He was watching Marius. He was learning. He was waiting. There was another young man in that army whose future would dwarf them all. Marius had married Julia, of the old Julian house, and through her he was uncle by marriage to a boy still in Rome named Gaius Julius Caesar. The family that stood in Marius's shadow that summer would one day inherit the machine he was building on this plain. Marius had studied the ground for weeks. He knew that in the late morning a steady wind rose out of the east and lifted the fine soil off the flats. He knew where the sun would stand at the hour of battle, high and behind the Roman line, wind at their backs, glare in the enemy's eyes. The Cimbri would fight half-blind and choking on their own field. Marius was not planning a battle. He was staging an execution. There was a sign the men clung to as well. Plutarch records that 2 vultures were seen following the army for days before the fight. Marked with bronze rings the soldiers had once fastened to their necks, and the men took the birds as a promise of victory. Marius kept his Syrian prophetess Martha near his tent, dressed in purple, carried in a covered litter, reading the entrails, and every reading came back the same. The gods were with them. His wife had brought the woman to camp, and whether Marius believed her or merely used her hardly mattered. His men believed her. The night before the battle, Plutarch says, Marius offered sacrifice, and the man who read the victims told him to hold back and wait for the right hour, for the omens promised victory only if he did not rush. Marius listened. He would not throw his men forward until the sun and the wind stood where he wanted them. On the day, the 30th of July, the Cimbri formed up. The sight would have frozen a lesser man. A nation drawn into one solid block that ran for miles across the plain. Plutarch gives the square 30 stadia to a side, close to 3 miles of packed flesh and iron. The front rank had done something no Roman had seen. The warriors were chained together at the waist, iron links running man to man. No one could flee without dragging his neighbor down. It was their answer to a broken line, a wall that could not run. They saw a chain of courage. Marius and Sulla, watching from the Roman side, saw a cage, a trap the victims had bolted shut on themselves. Behind the infantry rode 15,000 cavalry, their helmets shaped into the gaping heads of wild beasts, tall plumes above them to make each man loom taller than a man. They carried white shields that threw back the sun, wore iron breastplates, and hefted heavy double-pointed spears. A chant started low along the line and swelled into a roar. The war horns opened up, a sound like the world splitting. Then the mass began to move, and the ground took the tremor of it into the souls of the waiting Romans. Marius drew up his line with the 2 wings pushed forward and the center held back. He gave the center to Catullus and kept the wings under his own eye, a choice that would let him claim the victory as his own, and let Catullus complain about it for the rest of his life. Then Marius did a small thing that decided much. He lifted his hands to the sky and vowed 100 oxen to the gods if the day was his. Then he ordered his men to hold their ground and let the enemy come, so the Cimbri would spend their strength crossing the open flat under the climbing sun. There was a private omen, too. Marius washed his hands, raised them toward heaven, and prayed aloud where his men could hear, promising a great sacrifice. Soldiers who see their general pray with confidence, fight with confidence. He knew that. Everything he did that morning was aimed at the minds of his own men as much as at the enemy. The cavalry charged first, a wave of iron aimed at the Roman flanks. Plutarch says they did not ride straight at the line. They wheeled to the right, trying to draw the Romans out of formation and pull them between the horse and the infantry to be crushed from both sides. It was a clever move. Marius saw through it. He held his men rooted, faces into the sun, and refused the bait. His own cavalry, Marius leading one wing and Sulla the other, swung wide and struck the Cimbri horse in the flank instead. Not duelists, herders. They turned the charge into a churning knot of men and mounts, and the grand attack dissolved into 1,000 separate fights across the dust. But the cavalry was never the point. Thousands of hooves tore the dry earth open, and a wall of dust climbed into the sky. Right on time, the wind came, out of the east, exactly as Marius had promised. Steady and hard, it drove the dust like a flood into the faces of the Cimbri infantry. The sun burned white in their eyes. The grit filled their mouths. Their nostrils packed their teeth. Men bred on clean, cold air were suffocating in a storm of Italian soil. They dropped their heads and shielded their faces and stumbled forward blind. They could hear the Romans. They could smell them. They could not see them. A chained, groping mass advancing on an enemy it could not find. Plutarch calls this dust the greatest cause of their ruin. It hid from them the size of the force they were walking into. Each man thought only a handful of Romans stood before him until the wall of shields was already on him. Into that fog, the first volley flew. Thousands of pila arched up and slammed into the front rank. The javelin was Marius's own design, a hard tip to punch through a shield and a soft iron neck that bent under its own weight so it could not be pulled out or thrown back. The Cimbri found their shields pinned with dragging iron, useless dead weight. Many threw them away and faced the line bare, blinded, choking, now stripped of cover. Then came the sound that meant the end. Not a war cry, a steady tramp of hobnailed sandals on packed earth. The Roman infantry walked out of the dust in silence, a moving wall of shields and iron. They did not run. They closed the gap, braced, and the two lines met with a crunch of bone and splitting shields. Here the battle went down into hell. The Cimbri were bigger, stronger, swinging long swords and axes with raw force. One-on-one, a warrior would have beaten a legionary every time. But the Romans did not fight one-on-one. They fought as one machine built for a single purpose. The legionary stayed behind his scutum. He did not swing. He jabbed. Short thrusts of the gladius from behind the shield wall. Into the belly. Into the groin. Into the throat. The man in front dropped, and the legionary stepped over the body and did it again. Step, stab, twist, pull. Nothing wasted. The killing edge was not in the thrust. It was in the rotation. A Cimbri warrior in the front rank fought until he died, or his arms failed. The Roman did not. The maniples stood in a checkerboard with gaps between them, and after a few minutes in the press, the front rank filtered back through those gaps, while a rested rank stepped up. So, the Cimbri were not facing one army. They were facing 3, 4 in succession. A river of fresh killers that never ran dry. The heat drained their legs. The dust stole their wind, and the stabbing rhythm bled the nation white, one gut wound at a time. Sweat blinded them faster than the dust. Plutarch says the Cimbri, strangers to the heat, poured with sweat and gasped for air, holding their shields over their heads against a sun they could not fight. Their own iron cooked them. Some fell dead with no wound on them at all, killed by the heat and the crush before a Roman blade ever reached them. There was one moment the Romans told for years afterward. As the front ranks of the Cimbri buckled, they fell back not in a rout, but in a slow, ordered retreat toward their own wagons, trying to hold together. It did not save them. The Roman line came on at the same walking pace, killing as it walked, refusing to break formation to chase, and refusing to let them rest. A retreat with no gap in it. A death that followed at a walking pace. Boiorix was still on the field. The old king would not leave it. He and the other chiefs, Plutarch says, rode into the thick of the fighting and died there sword in hand, choosing the front rank over flight. The men who had led a nation out of the drowning north would not outlive it. For anyone drawn to how the Roman war machine actually worked, the book this script was built on is a monolith of military history, the most complete archive of legionary tactics I have come across. To grasp how a battle like this was engineered rather than won, this is the source to own. It is available right now. Look to your screen and tap the View Products button to find it on the shelf. While you are there, you will see we have also opened a curated collection of themed relics, artifacts chosen to bring the world of Marius and Sulla within reach. Open that shelf, explore it, and claim a piece of this history while we descend into the last moments of the Cimbri. The line did not break. It could not. The chains meant to hold them firm now held them to die. The men in the rear kept pushing forward, blind to the slaughter at the front. The men at the front fell where they stood, unable to step back. The great square began to crush itself, compressing under the Roman weight, the wounded screaming into a wind that swallowed the sound. And even in the middle of the killing, the two Roman generals began to quarrel over it. Catullus's men had held the center and done the closest work. Marius's wings had swept wide, and in the blinding dust, they had drifted past much of the main body and struck less of it than they claimed. When night fell and the dead were counted, both commanders sent word to Rome that the day belonged to him. Ambassadors from the town of Parma, who had come to the camp on business, were led out across the field and asked to judge whose spears stood thickest in the enemy dead. They walked the ground and pointed to the ranks where Catullus's javelins bristled from the fallen. Two of Catullus's own cohorts even swore an oath and named the town as witness. Marius took the credit anyway. The soldiers back in Rome would shout his name, not Catullus's, and they would call him the third founder of the city, set beside Romulus. The rivalry that would one day drown Rome in its own blood was already breathing on the day of its greatest triumph. But that reckoning was for later. Out on the Raudian Plain, in the heat and the grit and the roar of the horns, the Cimbri were dying by the thousand, and not one of them could run. The chained line began to die from the inside. The men at the front were cut apart, their bodies stacking into a wall the men behind had to climb over to reach the killing. The chains meant to make them brave, now made them a single organism fed slowly into a thresher. A wounded man could not fall. The links held him upright between the warriors on either side, forced to watch his own belly open onto the dirt until a second thrust finished him. The dead pulled on the living, feet tangled in bodies. The great square stopped being a formation. It became a heap, a mound of struggling, shackled men dying in each other's arms. The Roman legionary worked in near silence. That was the sound the survivors remembered, the few who lived to tell it. Not shouting. The steady grunt of men doing labor. Stab, step, breathe. A butcher's rhythm on a scale no butcher had ever known. Somewhere in that press, Boiorix was still swinging. He was no longer a king. He was one more shape in the dust, hacking at gray figures that came out of the fog. He had asked for a saga written in blood and steel. He got a suffocating, nameless death in a crowd. No champion faced him. No poet watched. A shield caught him in the side and threw him off balance. A gladius went in low, under his guard, through the stomach. Another found his throat. He went down and was trampled by his own men as they were butchered above him. The legionaries who stepped over his body never knew whose body it was. His fall went unnoticed at first. Then the word moved through the dying ranks like a current. The king is dead. Whatever held them upright inside snapped. Boiorix had led a nation out of the drowning north, and now the nation had nowhere left to follow him. The will to fight did not break. It vanished. The Roman line punched through what remained of the square. The battle was finished. The massacre started. The Cimbri turned to run and found the chains had become anchors. Men tripped on the fallen and dragged down the ones they were bound to. Whole rows collapsed into knots of thrashing limbs, and the legionaries walked in and stabbed down into the mass until it went still. Those who tore loose and fled were ridden down. The Roman cavalry, done with the flanks, became a machine of pursuit, galloping across the flat, spearing men through the back, cutting at necks and shoulders. No surrender was offered. Marius had given a plain order: erase them. Not every legionary shared his fervor. In the confusion, men would brawl over credit for the enemy standards, and one soldier who claimed to have taken an eagle was later found by his own comrades to have stripped it from a Roman corpse. Even in triumph, the army was already turning on itself over the spoils. The chase ran for miles, a trail of bodies leading back to the last thing the Cimbri had left: the circle of wagons. Inside that ring, the women and children and the old had waited through the noise, listening for word of victory. What reached them was the drum of Roman hooves and the screaming of their own men. The legionaries smashed into the wagon fort, expecting weeping captives ready for the slave pens. They met an army instead. The women did not beg. They grabbed what was near: wood axes, the spears and swords of dead husbands, kitchen knives, and heavy iron pots. And they fought. They threw themselves at the legionaries, cursing, hacking, stabbing, guarding their children with the last of their strength. A soldier reaching to seize a woman found an axe buried in his helmet. They were not fighting to live. They were fighting for the right to end it their own way. They had done this before. A year earlier at Aquae Sextiae, the Ambron women had held the wagon line with axes until the last of them fell, and word of it had spread through both peoples. The Cimbri women knew what surrender meant and what the alternative cost. They had already chosen. It could not hold. The Romans came in endless waves. For every one a woman killed, 10 more came over the wagons. The defense broke, and the soldiers poured into the heart of the camp. Then the last act began. The women turned away from the enemy and toward their own children. A crying infant went silent as a mother swung him by the ankles and broke his skull against a wagon hub. Another held her 2 small daughters close, then drew a knife across their throats. They would not let their blood live on in Roman chains. They would not raise sons for the slave market or daughters for the men who had just gutted their fathers. They chose the dark instead. When the children were dead, they turned on themselves. They braided nooses from their own hair and hanged themselves from the ox yokes. They climbed onto the wagon tops, tied ropes to their necks, and jumped. They set their husbands' swords against their chests and fell forward. Plutarch tells of 2 found together, each hanging from the same wagon, their children tied by the ankles and swinging from their feet. Some, when the ropes ran out, went to the dogs. The Cimbri kept great war hounds, and the story reached Rome that these animals guarded the wagons even after their masters were dead, fighting the legionaries off the corpses so that the soldiers had to bring bows and shoot them down before they could take the camp. It was a whole people erasing itself with method and care. They had come south for a patch of earth to call home. They found it on the Raudian Plain. It was a grave. When the silence came, nothing was left. The field lay under bodies for miles. Roman writers, stretching the count, but not the horror, claimed 140,000 Cimbri killed in the battle and the rout, and 60,000 more, mostly women and children who had not managed to end themselves, taken and sold. A people who had wandered Europe for over a decade, a name that had haunted Rome like no threat since Hannibal, was wiped out in one afternoon under the July sun. For years after, the local farmers said, their vineyards gave harvests they had never seen, the soil fed by the thousands of dead left to rot on the plain. The town of Vercellae grew rich off ground that had once been an open grave, and men joked uneasily that the best wine in the region tasted of the north. A handful of Cimbri survived. The Tigurini, the tribe of Alpine stock who had helped destroy a Roman army 14 years earlier, had held back in the foothills as a rearguard. When the news came off the plain, they did not fight. They melted back over the passes and vanished into the valleys they had come from. The great migration that had begun on the drowned coast of Jutland ended not with a treaty, but with a few thousand frightened people slipping home in the dark, leaving a nation behind them on Italian soil. Some of the captives had a fate stranger than death. Later writers preserved the memory of a band of Cimbri prisoners sent to the arena to fight for Roman entertainment, who chose to strangle each other in their cells instead. The last man, left alone, was found hanged with a strap he had torn from his own harness. Even in chains, deep inside Italy, they kept the compact they had made on the plain. They would not be a spectacle. There was one long shadow the massacre could not touch. Far away, in the cold coast the Cimbri had abandoned, other tribes filled the empty land. A century and a half later, a Roman fleet under the general Drusus sailed those waters, and the local people sent envoys to the Emperor Augustus, offering their most sacred cauldron as a gift, begging forgiveness for what their grandfathers' grandfathers had done to Rome. Tacitus recorded it. The name Cimbri had outlived the people. It had become a word for the edge of the world and the terror that once came out of it. In Rome, the news landed like a reprieve from the gods. Men wept in the streets. Women who had put on mourning after erasure took the black off and poured wine at the household shrines. Marius was hailed as the savior of the city, the third founder of Rome, set beside Romulus and Camillus in the people's mouths. They poured libations to him in their homes alongside the gods themselves, an honor never given a living man before. A joint triumph was voted for both consuls, but the poison was already at work before the wine was poured. Catulus claimed the day. His men had held the center, he said, borne the weight of the fighting, killed the king, taken the standards. He led out ambassadors from Parma to walk the field and testify that his javelins stood thickest in the dead, and 2 of his cohorts swore an oath to it. He later wrote a memoir in plain Latin, praised for its clean style, laying out his version so history would not hand everything to Marius. Behind him stood the man who pushed the claim hardest, his quaestor Lucius Cornelius Sulla, hungry to strip the glory from the low-born general he had once served and now could not stand. Sulla, too, would write his own account one day, 22 books of it, finished on his deathbed, still settling the score. Marius scoffed. He knew whose reforms had built the army, whose eye had chosen the ground and the wind and the hour, whose discipline had held the line while the enemy cooked in the dust. And his soldiers knew it too. The landless men he had raised from the alleys of Rome, his mules, had not bled for Catulus or for the Senate. They had bled for Marius, on the promise of land at the end of it. Now they looked to him, and only him, to make good on it. He tried to keep the peace at first. On the day of the joint triumph, he refused to ride alone, and shared the road with Catulus, the army marching behind them both. But the crowd shouted one name. When the two consuls sat down together at the victory banquet, every cup was raised to Marius, and Catulus sat and drank and remembered. Plutarch says Marius had taken to drinking from a cup shaped like the one Bacchus was said to carry, playing the returning god, and the aristocrats who watched a farmer's son strike that pose found it grating beyond words. To settle his veterans, Marius turned to a tribune named Lucius Appuleius Saturninus, a firebrand who forced a land law through the assembly by violence, granting the soldiers ground in Gaul and overseas. When the Senate balked, Saturninus made the senators swear an oath to uphold the law or lose their seats. Quintus Caecilius Metellus, called Numidicus, the aristocrat who had once commanded Marius in Africa and despised him ever since, refused the oath and walked into exile rather than bend. The reward for the men who saved Italy was rammed through over the corpse of the Constitution. Then it turned on Marius. Consul for the 6th time in 100 BC, he found he could not leash the violence he had used. Saturninus turned murderer. A rival candidate for the consulship, Gaius Memmius, was clubbed to death in the open street with wooden clubs while men watched from the porticos. The Senate passed its final decree and ordered Marius to put his own ally down. He did. Saturninus and his men were driven onto the Capitol. The water pipes were cut in the summer heat, and when they came down to surrender under Marius's own promise of safety, the young nobles climbed onto the roof of the Senate house, tore off the tiles, and stoned them to death from above before the consul could intervene. The savior of Rome had spent his entire glory in a single year and ended it standing over the bodies of the very men who had won his veterans their land. The aristocrats who had feared him now watched him flounder, a soldier drowning in politics he did not understand. His name became a thing to be used, not obeyed. He left Rome, sailed east on the excuse of a religious vow, and waited, telling anyone who would listen that a prophecy had promised him a 7th consulship. He clung to it like a man clinging to a plank in open water. That was the true legacy of Vercellae. In saving the Republic from the enemy outside, Marius had built a worse one inside its own walls. He had shown that a popular general with an army that depended on him for its living could hold the state by the throat. He had taught the Roman soldier that loyalty belonged not to a distant senate, but to the man who led him to victory and reward. Sulla stood in the dust of that plain and watched the lesson land, and he never forgot it. 11 years later, in 88 BC, the two men fought over the command against King Mithridates of Pontus, and Sulla did the unthinkable. He turned his legions around and marched them into Rome itself, the first Roman general ever to lead an army against the city. Marius fled for his life. He was run to ground in the marshes of Minturnae, dragged out buried in mud to the neck. An old man hunted through the country he had twice saved. A slave sent to cut his throat could not raise the blade in the dark of the cell, and Marius growled up at him, "Do you dare to kill Gaius Marius?" And the man dropped the sword and ran. He escaped by sea to Africa and sat among the ruins of Carthage, one broken thing looking at another across the sand. And when a Roman official ordered him to leave, he sent back a single line. "Tell him you have seen Gaius Marius sitting in the ruins of Carthage." He came back with an army of his own and took a revenge that drowned the forum. Heads of senators and knights were nailed up on the rostra where laws had once been read aloud, and men who passed his gate without saluting were killed on his nod. He died in 86 BC, consul for the 7th time exactly as the prophecy had promised, worn out and half-mad with fever, 17 days into the term, muttering about commands he would never hold. Then Sulla returned from the east, outkilled him, and made himself dictator. He posted prescription lists in the forum with prices on thousands of names, and the severed heads stacked at the rostra where Marius had stacked his own enemies a few years before. He even had Marius's ashes dug up and scattered in the river. The republic that had broken its oldest rule to make Marius its shield had been taught by that same man exactly how to die. The Cimbri were gone. The specter they had summoned was never the barbarian at the gate. It was the warlord within, and it would haunt Rome from that July afternoon until the Republic drew its last breath under a man named Gaius Julius Caesar, who happened to be Marius's own kin by marriage, and who learned the whole lesson without ever setting foot on the Raudian Plain. Rome was saved that afternoon. The price was its own soul. Thank you for staying to the very end. If you believe these stories from the heart of the Empire deserve to keep being told, subscribe to the channel, leave a like on this video, and send it to one person who needs to see the real, unvarnished history of Rome. You've just watched another premium documentary by Romanus, your home of Roman Empire on YouTube. Your descent into the past does not end here. The video now appearing on your screen is your next step. Click it, watch it now, and keep going deeper.